In this lecture I want to talk a bit more and explain the idea of adaptive capacity, which is a theory about what it is that enables societies to adapt to climate change. It's a generic theory, and I want to think a little bit more about how it might apply and what it might mean in the South Pacific. This is a fairly interesting photo that I think says something about adaptive capacity. This is a traditional one-person canoe in the island of Funafuti. If you look very closely, you can see very little of this is made out of traditional materials. In fact, probably only the outrigger there is actually made out of a local tree. The hull is actually made out of tin. The crossbeams are made out of timber, probably imported from somewhere else, and the seat, you can see, has been recovered from some school somewhere. So the absence of building materials in Funafuti hasn't stopped people to continue to make these one-person canoes. It's an adaptation to a change in the environment, and it's an adaptation that preserves culture and maintains the continuity of culture, even if the environment has changed. And this is a fairly indicative case of adaptation in the Pacific, that though modern times come to the region, though environments may change, practices and cultural practices and things that are important to people still persist in various ways. It's called the indigenisation of modernity, taking what modern society brings and adapting it into traditional cultures. So this discussion about adaptive capacity begins here, that there's a difference between knowing what could be done to adapt to climate change. Could build a desalination plant or build a rainwater tank or provide for better coastal zone management or better disaster risk management. There's a difference between knowing what to do. Actually, that's in some cases not very hard to know what to do, but actually being able to do it is another thing altogether. We probably know how to solve poverty in the world, we're just not very good at doing it. So this ability to take action in climate change policy and climate change research is called adaptive capacity, the ability of the characteristics of social groups, and in some cases ecosystems, to adapt to changing environments that occur because of climate change, and changes that occur simultaneously with climate change, currency fluctuations, population changes, or whatever. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose definitions are always unwieldy, defines adaptive capacity like this: the ability of a system to adjust to climate change, including variability in extremes, to moderate potential damages, to take advantages of opportunities, or to cope with consequences. The theory about adaptive capacity is this, that one can consider the capacity of a society, and typically this is applied to countries, as being a combination of these things: economic resources, money basically, natural capital, whether there's an abundance of environmental things in the system, and in the case of islands, land, for example, is a fairly important form of natural capital. If you have a lot of it, you can move around. If you don't, then you're constrained in that sense. Social capital, which is about the networking between groups within society and the bonding within those groups within society, and collective action, and well-coordinated collective action is thought to be a fairly important element of adaptive capacity. Technology are the tools and techniques available to implement adaptation. Can you implement a desalination plant? Do you have the skills to do so? Information and skills. Is it known? Are you capable of understanding what could be done? Have you the technical ability to implement those things? And they might be management skills or governance skills, skills in the area of policy, or skills in the area of quite specific things like new agricultural practices. Infrastructure seems to be important. Societies that have fairly dense and robust networks of infrastructure tend to be able to deal with change better, environmental change better, perhaps, than others. And the responsiveness of institutions: if there's a decision that is made or a change that occurs, can the regular social practices that order society change in response to those changes, or change in response to a decision that we need to change? Now, this is good theory, don't have much of a problem with it really, but it is really basically a theory about development per se. These are basically the characteristics of rich, developed economies, and the degree to which they're present in other kinds of economies somewhat determines the degree to which they are developing or least developed economies. In other words, this is a theory about development economics applied to the case of climate change, which is good. Didn't have a theory, not a bad theory, but it does, because it comes from development economics, apply to the countries where development economics typically draws its attention, which are big countries with large land areas, typically in Africa, South Asia, East Asia, South America. How well it applies to the islands of the Pacific is a different question. And the degree to which these things have ever been particularly important in development in the Pacific Islands is an interesting question. And the degree to which they explain the capacity of Pacific Islands to adapt to climate change is questionable, in my opinion. Anyway, so here's a kind of standard example. This is a house in Mudgero in the Marshall Islands. For this household to be able to protect their house from rising sea levels and storms requires them to have a certain number of things that the theory of adaptive capacity helps us to identify. They need money, they need skills, they need to be able to negotiate with landowners and the government to build this thing, to claim this as their property, and so on. And not every household in Mudgero can certainly do this because they don't have the money or the skills to do so. So these guys, you'd say, they have high adaptive capacity, they have an adaptation of a sort going on here. Here's another example also from the Marshall Islands, and atolls, low-lying atolls that have high populations and some degree of consumption of modern things that are imported, cars, things made of metal, things made of plastic, you name it, need to do something with that waste, otherwise it very quickly damages their environment. So collecting and disposing of waste safely is actually a significant governance and logistic problem on an atoll environment. You have to get it, you have to sort it, you have to safely dispose it, you have to treat what you can on site and export what you can't treat on site if possible. That requires organisation, it requires good policy, it requires a certain amount of infrastructure, and it requires a certain amount of money. And this level of organisation about dealing with solid waste doesn't exist in all islands in the South Pacific. Yet it matters, because if waste isn't dealt with properly, groundwater becomes contaminated, reefs become more damaged, they're more vulnerable to damage as well. Okay, but there are some other things about adaptive capacity in the Pacific Islands, and one really only needs to fly across the Pacific Ocean and see these tiny little islands with people living on them in the middle of nowhere and think, well, they don't have a lot of land, they clearly don't have a lot of money, they have almost no technology and so on, and yet they're living meaningful lives, and they've been doing that for thousands of years. So what works for them? What are their capabilities, and what does that imply for their ability to respond to climate change? And here are some of the things that are particular to the Pacific Islands that aren't captured in the generic theory of adaptive capacity. People have been living in these islands for thousands and thousands of years. They know, the knowledge exists when the moon is in a certain location and the wind is blowing from a certain direction and it's this time of year, the fish can be found there. They know when to plant things, they know when to harvest things, they know how to manage their crops, they know how to build and to grow things under different conditions of environmental change. Because if they don't, they'd be dead. The ability of people to live in very marginal environments in the middle of the Pacific for thousands and thousands of years says they know a great deal about their local environments. They know about change. And that's an incredible resource that will enable them to adapt to climate change. They have ways of making decisions that are much more involved and engaged and locally intimate than the kinds of governance systems we have in big developed economies. There are all sorts of customary decision-making processes, networks of groups and committees. Gender has an important role in all these processes as well. That means that decisions that are made are typically legitimate decisions in the sense that everybody can recognise the right of the people who made those decisions and accept that they are fair and justifiable decisions. And so when a decision gets made, it happens. And most people are on board with it. They have very interesting land tenure systems, and for the most part, in most places, this means land is shared much better in the Pacific Islands than it is in countries like Australia, where land is exclusively owned. It's my property, it's mine, you can't have it. That idea doesn't exist to the same degree in the Pacific Islands. So an island like Funafuti in Tuvalu, for example, something like 3/4 of the population of that island weren't born there and don't have a claim to live on the land. It's not in their family land necessarily. Yet almost everybody lives in a house that has running water and a flush toilet. So how is it possible that 3/4 of the population can live in a small island, though they don't own land. There's forms of sharing, forms of subleasing and letting that are going on here that are very accommodating of others and that suggest that property rights are managed very differently in the Pacific Islands than they are in developed countries. And it's a real strength of the land tenure system, that it is less exclusive and typically less hard fought for than in other places. All sorts of interesting systems of exchange go on, not just about exchanging money, but exchanging gifts, exchanging all sorts of resources, including money, at certain ceremonial events. So for example, coming of age ceremonies in Polynesia have typically been events where family and friends have bestowed upon the person who's coming of age a certain amount of wealth to set them up for life. It's a form of exchange that carries with it some obligations that when the person grows up or when their family is invited to another coming of age ceremony, they also exchange things. But it's not simply buying and selling things in the market. High degrees of care for elders, for example. Old people are typically really well looked after in the Pacific Islands by their own children or by their relatives or just by people in the community. Given food very frequently, cared for very frequently. Not a transaction of a commodity as occurs, for example, in most developed countries. We put our old people in nursing homes and we just pay for that. All sorts of insurance systems, and so people typically band together and provide insurance after disasters. They help each other to rebuild their homes. They help each other all the time. They're not sitting around waiting for an insurance company to come and help them. This is all tied together by kinship and by very well understood networks of relations that occur within villages, across countries, across the region, and indeed outside the region. And so people in the Pacific will typically know who all their quite distant cousins are and where they live and know what claims they can make upon them in times of crisis. So for example, when cyclones strike islands in the Pacific, quite a lot of additional support, money, clothing, materials and so on comes from sometimes quite distant relatives living in developed countries in the United States, New Zealand or Australia. It's the effect of kinship. Remittances, the money that's sent back and other material things that are sent back from family members living abroad is a very important part of the way people make lives and develop themselves in the Pacific, and is a really significant element of adaptive capacity too. And finally, many countries in the Pacific are fairly aid dependent. They do get high transfers of development assistance, and this too is an important element of adaptive capacity. Now, none of these things are particularly captured in the standard theory of adaptive capacity. If you apply the standard theory of adaptive capacity to the Pacific Islands, what you see are small places without much money, without much technology, with governance systems that we don't really understand, with land tenure systems that we don't really understand, and we draw the conclusion that they are very low on all the criteria of adaptive capacity. And we would draw the conclusion then that they're highly vulnerable to climate change. And we might then begin to think about climate change policies in the wrong way, as about trying to address deficiencies, things that have never been there and that might never be there, as opposed to looking at what does work, how people do adapt to environmental change, how people do live their lives, and saying, well, they do have certain capabilities and skills. They're not completely vulnerable, and maybe if we work with what works in the Pacific Islands, if we build on their strengths, then a different adaptation outcome can be achieved. So here's a couple of examples. We move from thinking about generic adaptive capacity, a set of things that is true across all societies, to very specific adaptation tasks, and capacities differ. A simple problem, in a sense, about rainwater and providing fresh water in Funafuti and Tuvalu. Two options. One is harvesting rainwater off roofs. And what does this entail? This entails a certain amount of money. It's probably beyond the means of poor people to buy a rainwater tank and to change their roof and to build gutters to store water. But it's not really very expensive as an aid program, and most households in Funafuti now have a rainwater tank, and for most of them it was provided by Australian aid. The costs of maintaining things are fairly low. The technology is quite simple. We need to filter the water and keep the gutters clean, but households understand this and can maintain their rainwater tanks. And it doesn't require any particularly complicated political decision making. Everybody does this for themselves, and it works. The alternative, which also exists in Funafuti, is a desalinisation plant. Now, it's very expensive, costs a lot of money, and the desalinisation plant in Funafuti was provided by Japanese government, I believe, but beyond the means of the government. It took a late aid project, and it costs an awful lot to run in terms of fuel, and it costs an awful lot to maintain it, and the skills to maintain this have to be brought in for the most part when it needs maintaining and breaking down. So suddenly a big cost to keep this thing going. Technology is very sophisticated and isn't a technology that people in Tavali themselves would have been able to produce. And the governance of this is quite difficult. So when there's a drought and the desalinisation plant is running, the water has to be collected, put in trucks and distributed to households, and this then raises questions about who gets the water first and who gets the water last and who gets the most and on what basis and so on. So there's some difficult politics around this question. So two different adaptation responses with two different sets of capabilities required to implement them. They both work. This is a desalinisation plant. But they perhaps are not both equally sustainable from an economic, political or cultural sense. So the capacity to adapt is intrinsic to social systems. There are some things that maybe are generic, but there are many, many things that are quite particular to the groups that require or for which adaptation is necessary. And because social systems differ, then so too does adaptive capacity, and trying to measure it using standard frameworks isn't necessarily particularly helpful. Just being poor and just living a long way from major markets doesn't necessarily mean that people's adaptive capacity is very low. Having said that, just because there is some degree of adaptive capacity, and even having very high adaptive capacity, doesn't necessarily mean that adaptation will happen. And this is a discussion about barriers to adaptation, which we'll talk about next week.